My son said that my construction career was embarrassing and called me worthless. So I sold the house he expected to inherit and removed him from my will. My son called me worthless. I worked construction for 35 years to give my son Zachary everything he wanted. Private schools, soccer camps, a brand new car at 16, full college tuition, no student loans. His mother left when he was 8, said being a parent was too hard, and moved to Arizona with some guy she met online. I did it all alone after that. Every school play, every soccer game, every science fair, I was there with bells on even after 12-hour shifts laying concrete. Zachary never wanted for anything, and I made sure he knew he was loved every single day. When he graduated from college with his finance degree, I was the proudest dad in that stadium. He got a job at an investment firm, making good money right out the gate. I helped him with his apartment deposit, co-signed his lease, and even furnished the whole place because I wanted him to start his adult life right. He'd call me every Sunday to catch up, came over for dinner twice a month, and always said I was the best dad anyone could ask for. Things were good between us. Then I retired at 58. My back was shot from all those years of construction, and the doctor said I needed to stop or I'd be in a wheelchair by 65. I had a decent pension, my house was paid off, and I'd saved enough to live comfortably. Not rich, but comfortable. In the first month of retirement, Zachary called less, said he was busy with work, which I understood. In the second month, he started making comments about how nice it must be to sit around all day. When I mentioned I was thinking about taking up woodworking, he said it was cute that I needed hobbies to fill my empty time. The real change came when he got promoted to senior analyst. Suddenly, my construction career was embarrassing to him. When his coworkers asked what his father did, he'd say I was between things right now. Not retired between things. Like I was unemployed looking for work instead of retired after decades of breaking my body to pay for his life. At his company Christmas party, he introduced me to his boss as his father, who used to work in manual labor, but was trying to find his purpose now. His boss asked what I meant by manual labor, and before I could answer, Zachary said I did basic construction, nothing requiring much skill. Basic construction. I built hospitals, schools, and the office building his fancy firm worked in. But to him, it was basic. The comments got worse. When I'd give him advice, he'd say the world had changed since my time, and I couldn't understand modern problems. When I offered to help with his taxes, he laughed and said TurboTax was probably too complicated for me. When I mentioned I was proud of him, he said at least one of us had accomplished something meaningful with our lives. Then came his birthday dinner. I took him to his favorite steakhouse, just the two of us like we'd done since he was little. Halfway through dinner, he got a call from his girlfriend. Put her on speaker right there at the table. She asked what he was doing, and he said his dad was buying him dinner since it was the only thing he could contribute anymore. She laughed and said at least I was good for something. Zachary agreed and said once I sold my house, I'd actually be useful again because he could invest the money properly instead of it sitting there being worthless like me. Worthless? That word just hung there. The waiter heard it. The couple next to us heard it. I heard my son, whom I gave everything to, call me worthless. I paid for dinner and left without saying much. Zachary didn't even notice something was wrong. The next Sunday, he called asking to borrow $5,000 for some investment opportunity. Said it was the least I could do since I wasn't contributing to society anymore. I said I'd think about it. That week, I made some changes. First, I removed him as beneficiary on my life insurance and retirement accounts. Put my niece's name instead. The kid was working 2 jobs to pay for community college. Then I sold my house. The one Zachary grew up in, assumed he'd inherit. Sold it for $400,000 cash to a developer who was going to tear it down and build condos. Zachary found out when he drove by and saw the sold sign. He called, screaming about his childhood home, his memories, his inheritance. I reminded him the house was worthless like me, so it shouldn't matter. I moved into a nice apartment downtown, one of those retirement communities with a pool and activities. Started dating a woman named Linda from my water aerobics class. Life was actually great. Zachary kept calling about the house money, saying I should invest it with him. He can't believe my answer. I told him no. The word came out firm and clear. I wasn't investing the house money with him because I was using it to live my life the way I wanted. The phone went silent. Not just quiet, but completely dead air like he'd hung up. I pulled the phone away from my ear to check if the call had dropped. Still connected. 10 seconds passed. 20. I could hear him breathing on the other end, short and fast. Then he exploded. His voice came through so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. He called me selfish, said I was being ridiculous and throwing away a great opportunity, said he was trying to help me and I was too stubborn to see it. The yelling went on for 5 minutes straight. I didn't interrupt. Just let him get it all out while I looked around my new living room with its big windows and morning light. When he finally ran out of steam, I told him I'd made my decision and hung up. My hands were shaking, but I felt good. Really good. The next morning, someone knocked on my door at 7:30. I was still in my bathrobe having coffee. Opened the door, and there stood Zachary in his work suit, looking like he hadn't slept. He pushed past me into the apartment without asking. Started looking around at everything, the new furniture, the view, the kitchen with its modern appliances. He kept asking how much rent cost. What was I paying per month? Was it a lease or month to month? I could see him doing math in his head, calculating how much of his inheritance I was wasting on this place every single month. He walked through every room like he was doing an inspection, opened closets, looked in the bathroom, stood at the bedroom window staring out at the city. When he came back to the living room, he had this look on his face like I'd personally betrayed him. Linda was just leaving when Zachary started his second lap through the apartment. She'd come over for morning coffee like she did most days. I introduced them at the door. Linda shook his hand and smiled warm and friendly. Zachary stared at her like she'd grown a second head. His mouth actually hung open a little. Linda kissed my cheek goodbye and said she'd see me at water aerobics. The door closed behind her and Zachary turned to me with his eyes wide. He asked who that was. I told him. He asked how long I'd been seeing her. I told him that too. Then he asked if this woman was why I was making stupid financial decisions. Like Linda had somehow brainwashed me into selling my house and moving here. Like I couldn't make my own choices. That's when I'd had enough. We stood in my living room and I told him everything. Every comment he'd made since I retired. Every dismissive laugh. Every time he'd made me feel small. The between things comment at his work party. The basic construction comment to his boss. The TurboTax joke. All of it came pouring out. He tried to deny it at first. Said I was remembering things wrong. Then he switched tactics and said I was being too sensitive. That he was just joking around and I couldn't take a joke. That everyone talks to their parents that way. I pulled out my phone. Found the recording from his birthday dinner. Hit play. His own voice filled my living room talking about how I could only contribute by buying dinner. Then his girlfriend's laugh. Then him agreeing that I'd be useful once I sold the house because the money was just sitting there being worthless like me. The word worthless hung in the air between us. Zachary's face went white. Actually lost all its color like someone had drained the blood out. He stared at my phone like it was a bomb. Asked why I'd recorded that. I told him I'd started recording our conversations after the comments got bad because I needed proof I wasn't imagining things. That I wasn't being too sensitive. He tried to explain it away. Said it had been a stressful week at work. That he was venting. That he didn't mean it the way it sounded. I cut him off. Told him he wasn't getting a single dollar of my money ever again. Not for investments. Not for anything. That I'd worked 35 years breaking my back and I'd spend my money however I wanted. He stood there for a moment just staring at me. Then he turned and walked to the door. Slammed it so hard behind him that the whole frame shook. My neighbor from across the hall opened his door 30 seconds later, asking if everything was okay. That evening, Linda came back. She knocked soft and let herself in with the spare key I'd given her. Said she could tell something was wrong that morning when she left. I made us tea and told her everything. About Zachary, about the house, about why I'd sold it and moved here. She listened without saying a word, just held my hand and nodded. When I finished, she told me about her own daughter, how they hadn't spoken for 2 years over money issues, how her daughter had expected Linda to help buy her a house and got angry when Linda said no, how it took 2 years of silence before her daughter finally understood. The next week, I met with my lawyer. Made absolutely sure Zachary couldn't contest the will changes. We added extra protections, multiple witnesses, clear documentation of my mental state. The lawyer suggested I write a letter explaining my reasoning for the estate file. Something that would make my intentions crystal clear if anyone ever challenged them. I wrote the letter that night sitting at my kitchen table. Laid out every hurtful comment, every dismissive action. Not with anger, but with sad clarity about how our relationship had broken down. About how he'd stopped seeing me as his father and started seeing me as a bank account. About how that word worthless had finally made me realize I deserved better. I sealed the letter knowing Zachary would only read it after I was gone. Zachary started calling the next day. I let every call go to voicemail. The first messages were angry, yelling about how I was being unreasonable and stubborn. Then they got confused, asking why I was doing this and couldn't we just talk. Then almost apologetic, saying maybe he'd been too harsh and we should sit down like adults. But nothing he said acknowledged the real problem. Nothing addressed how he'd treated me. He just wanted access to the money again. Wanted things to go back to how they were. I deleted each message after listening and went about my day. The retirement community had a woodworking shop in the basement that I'd walked past a dozen times without going in. One morning I stopped at the door and watched an older man working on a chair leg with a hand plane. The smell of fresh wood shavings hit me, and something in my chest loosened. I walked in and asked if the shop was open to everyone. The man looked up and smiled. He introduced himself as Frank and said they met every Tuesday and Thursday morning. No experience needed. I showed up that Thursday with my toolbox from home. Frank set me up at a workbench and showed me the basics of measuring and cutting. My hands remembered things my brain had forgotten. 35 years of reading blueprints and measuring twice meant I could visualize how pieces fit together before I cut them. Within 2 weeks, I'd built a small side table. Nothing fancy, but the joints were tight and the surface was smooth. Frank examined it and whistled. He asked where I'd learned to work with such precision. I told him about construction, and he nodded like that explained everything. The other members started asking me questions about angles and load-bearing joints. They treated my construction background like it was valuable knowledge worth learning from. I started a second project, a bookshelf this time, and felt more excited about it than I'd felt about anything in months. Linda called on Saturday morning and asked if I wanted to have dinner that night. Not just coffee or lunch, but actual dinner. I said yes before my brain caught up with my mouth. She suggested an Italian place downtown that she'd been wanting to try. I spent an hour trying on different shirts before settling on a blue button-down that didn't look like I was trying too hard. The restaurant had white tablecloths and candles on every table. Linda wore a green dress that made her eyes look brighter. We ordered wine, and she told me about her 30 years as a nurse in the emergency room. The stories she shared were funny and sad and real. She talked about retiring last year and struggling with the same thing I was dealing with. That feeling of being useless after spending decades being needed. She asked about my construction career and actually listened when I told her about the projects I was proudest of. Didn't interrupt or look bored or check her phone. When I mentioned Zachary, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said her own kids had gone through phases where they didn't appreciate what she'd sacrificed. That sometimes children needed distance to understand what their parents had given them. The waiter brought tiramisu with 2 forks and we shared it while talking about places we wanted to travel. I drove her home and walked her to her door. She kissed my cheek and said she'd had a wonderful time. I floated back to my apartment. 2 weeks passed without hearing from Zachary. I'd started to think maybe he'd finally gotten the message. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Zachary standing there with Alyssa next to him. My stomach dropped, but I opened the door. Zachary looked nervous. Alyssa had her customer service smile plastered on. She launched into this speech about how sorry she was for what she'd said on the phone that night. How she'd been having a bad day and took it out in a joke that wasn't funny. The words sounded practiced, like she'd rehearsed them in the car. Nothing about what she said felt genuine. Zachary stood there nodding along like a puppet. I let her finish, then told them both I appreciated her coming here, but I needed space right now. Alyssa's smile cracked. She looked at Zachary like he was supposed to fix this. He asked if we could just talk for a few minutes. I said no, not today. Maybe not for a while. I needed time to figure out what I wanted from our relationship going forward. Alyssa started to argue, but I closed the door. Stood there with my hand on the knob, listening to them whisper in the hallway before their footsteps faded away. My phone rang the next morning. Roger's name showed on the screen. I answered, and he started thanking me for naming Jasmine as beneficiary on my accounts. Said he'd heard through family gossip about me and Zachary having problems. He was careful with his words, didn't take sides or ask for details. Just said he was grateful and Jasmine had cried when she found out. Happy tears. She'd been so stressed about paying for school, and now she could breathe a little easier. Roger's voice got thick when he told me what it meant to him that I'd thought of his daughter. That I'd seen how hard she worked and wanted to help. I told him Jasmine deserved it. She was doing everything right and I was proud to support her. Roger said Jasmine wanted to thank me in person if I was okay with that. I suggested they come visit my new place this weekend. Bring Jasmine and we'd have lunch. Roger agreed immediately. Saturday arrived sunny and warm. I cleaned my apartment and set out sandwich stuff and chips. Roger and Jasmine showed up right on time carrying flowers and a box of cookies. Jasmine hugged me tight and thanked me 3 times before we even sat down. She was 22 with her mother's dark hair and Roger's easy smile. We made sandwiches and she pulled out her laptop to show me her community college projects. She was studying early childhood education, wanted to be a kindergarten teacher. The passion in her voice when she talked about working with kids made my chest hurt in a good way. She showed me lesson plans she'd created and artwork from children she'd worked with during her student teaching. Roger watched his daughter with obvious pride. After lunch, we walked around the retirement community. Jasmine loved the pool and the craft rooms. She asked about the woodworking shop and I took them down to see it. Showed them the bookshelf I was building. Jasmine ran her hand along the wood and said it was beautiful. This was what family support looked like. People who appreciated effort and celebrated each other's interests. Roger and Jasmine stayed for 3 hours. When they left, I sat on my couch feeling full in a way that had nothing to do with lunch. The retirement community manager posted flyers about a talent show happening in 2 weeks. Residents could enter any kind of talent they wanted. Singing, dancing, comedy, crafts. I thought about the small table I'd finished in woodworking club. Frank encouraged me to enter it, said it deserved to be seen. I filled out the entry form before I could talk myself out of it. The night of the talent show, the community room was packed. Linda sat in the third row and waved when she saw me. There were singers and a woman who did magic tricks, and a man who played accordion. My table sat on display with the other craft entries. When the judges announced the winners, I was shocked to hear my name called for second place. Linda jumped up and cheered. Frank and the other woodworking members clapped and whistled. I walked up to accept a blue ribbon and looked out at all these people celebrating something I'd made with my own hands. My back might be shot and my construction days might be over, but I could still create things. Still had skills worth recognizing. I hadn't felt this proud of myself in years, maybe ever. My email notification dinged 3 days later. Zachary's name in the sender field. I almost deleted it without reading. Something made me open it instead. The email was long. 3 full paragraphs of him trying to explain his behavior over the past year. He blamed work stress and pressure from Alyssa to appear successful in front of her friends. Said he'd gotten caught up in trying to prove himself and lost sight of what mattered. He admitted he'd been ashamed of things he should have been proud of. Asked if we could meet for coffee somewhere neutral to talk properly. The tone was different from his other messages. Less defensive, more genuine. I read it twice, trying to decide if I believed him. I waited 2 days before responding. Told him I'd meet him at a coffee shop near the park on Thursday at 10. Neutral ground where neither of us had history. Thursday morning, I got there 15 minutes early and ordered tea. Zachary walked in at exactly 10, looking terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, hair uncombed, shirt wrinkled like he'd pulled it from the laundry basket. He ordered coffee and sat across from me. Started talking before I could say anything. Apologized without making excuses or trying to justify what he'd said. Admitted he'd taken me for granted. That he'd said unforgivable things. His voice cracked when he mentioned the birthday dinner. Said he replayed that moment in his head every night and felt sick about it. I listened without interrupting. Let him get it all out. When he finished, I told him I appreciated the apology. That it meant something to hear him actually acknowledge what he'd done. But trust wasn't rebuilt overnight. Right now, I needed him to respect my boundaries and my choices about my own money and life. This wasn't about punishing him. It was about me protecting myself and living the way I wanted. He nodded and didn't argue. Didn't try to negotiate or convince me to change my mind. Just accepted what I said. That showed more maturity than anything he'd done in months. We sat there drinking our coffee in silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Before we left, I suggested we try having dinner once a month. Just the 2 of us. No talk about money or investments or who was successful, just trying to rebuild some kind of relationship if that was even possible. Zachary agreed immediately. Started to suggest the steakhouse where everything had fallen apart. I cut him off and said no. We needed a different place. A fresh start. He nodded and suggested a barbecue place he'd been to once. Casual, good food, no bad memories. I said that would work. We stood up and Zachary hugged me. Quick and awkward, but real. I watched him walk to his car and wondered if we could actually fix this. Our first monthly dinner happened at the barbecue place Zachary suggested. He showed up 15 minutes early, which surprised me since he'd been chronically late for the past year. We ordered ribs and brisket and ate without talking much at first. The silence wasn't angry anymore, just careful. Halfway through the meal, he set down his fork and told me he and Alyssa had broken up 3 weeks ago. She'd been pushing him constantly to get money from me, calling me selfish for not helping my own son, suggesting he threatened legal action over the house sale. He finally realized how toxic she was when she suggested he pretend to reconcile with me just to get access to my accounts. He worked through his feelings out loud while I listened, not gloating or saying I told you so. He admitted she'd fed into his worst instincts about money and success, making him believe his worth came from his bank account and job title. When he finished talking, I just nodded and said breakups were hard, even when they were the right choice. We finished our meal and agreed to meet again in a month. Linda had been talking about her daughter for weeks, mentioning how they hadn't spoken in 6 months over some argument about Linda's retirement choices. Her daughter thought she should have kept working instead of moving into a retirement community, said Linda was giving up on life. I finally convinced Linda to reach out, told her what I was learning about family relationships and second chances. She invited her daughter to lunch at the community center, asked if I'd be there for moral support. I sat 3 tables away pretending to read the newspaper while they talked. The daughter arrived tense, arms crossed, but Linda stayed calm and patient. She didn't defend her choices or argue, just listened when her daughter expressed worry about her being alone. After an hour, they were holding hands across the table. Linda came over after her daughter left and thanked me with tears in her eyes. She said watching Zachary and me try to rebuild helped her understand that healing required changed behavior, not just apologies. Her daughter was coming back next week for water aerobics together. At our second monthly dinner, Zachary seemed more relaxed, less like he was performing good behavior. We talked about his work without him bragging about deals or commissions. He asked about my woodworking club and actually listened when I described the projects I'd been making. I pulled out my phone and showed him pictures of a coffee table I'd just finished, a bookshelf I was working on for another community member, a jewelry box with dovetail joints. He studied each photo carefully, zooming in on the details, asking questions about the techniques. His tone was genuinely interested instead of condescending for the first time since I retired. He said the bookshelf was beautiful, really professional quality. And then he asked if I'd consider making him one for his apartment, said he'd pay whatever was fair for the materials and time. I told him I'd think about it. The old me would have jumped at the chance to do something for him. The new me needed to make sure this wasn't just another manipulation. The retirement community announced a trip to a big woodworking exhibition downtown, a whole convention center full of craftsmen showing their work and demonstrating techniques. I called Zachary and invited him to come along with our group. He said yes immediately, asked what day so he could request time off work. That surprised me since he'd always acted like taking time off was admitting weakness. The morning of the exhibition, he met us in the community lobby wearing jeans and a regular shirt instead of his usual business casual. He rode on the bus with us, talking easily with the other woodworking club members, asking them about their projects. At the exhibition, he stayed with our group instead of wandering off, watched demonstrations with real interest, asked the craftsmen intelligent questions. I watched him interact with my friends and saw glimpses of the son I'd raised, the one who used to be curious and respectful and kind. During lunch at the food court, he thanked me for inviting him, said he'd forgotten how much he enjoyed learning new things outside of work. We were watching a demonstration on wood turning when Zachary leaned close and said he needed to tell me something. We stepped away from the crowd, and he admitted he'd been in therapy for 2 months, dealing with issues around success and self-worth. His therapist helped him realize he'd tied his entire identity to his job title and income, measuring his value and everyone else's value in dollars. He was starting to understand why he'd looked down on my construction career, why he'd called it basic and worthless. It wasn't about the work itself, but about his own insecurity and need to feel superior. He said the therapy was hard, forcing him to examine beliefs he'd held for years, but he was committed to changing. His voice cracked when he apologized again for everything he'd said and done. I put my hand on his shoulder and told him I was proud of him for doing the work, for recognizing he had a problem and getting help. We stood there for a minute before rejoining the group. That night, I decided to make Zachary the bookshelf. Not because he asked or because I wanted his approval, but as a gesture of hope for our relationship. I spent the next 3 weeks planning it, sketching designs, selecting the wood. I chose cherry wood because it ages beautifully and gets richer over time, like I hoped our relationship would. Linda helped me pick out a stain that brought out the grain without hiding the natural color. The project became something bigger than furniture. Every joint I cut, every piece I sanded, I thought about forgiveness and second chances. I thought about the man I'd been when Zachary was young, working myself to exhaustion to give him everything. I thought about who I was now, learning to value myself beyond what I could provide. The bookshelf took shape slowly. 5 shelves with reinforced corners, a solid back panel, adjustable feet for uneven floors. I built it to last generations. When I finished the bookshelf, I called Zachary and asked if I could bring it over. He sounded excited and gave me a time that weekend. Linda helped me load it into a rental truck since it was too big for my car. We drove to his apartment building, and Zachary met us in the parking garage to help carry it up. Inside his apartment, I immediately noticed changes. The expensive modern artwork that used to cover his walls was gone, replaced with family photos and simple frames. Pictures of us from when he was young, at his soccer games, his high school graduation, family vacations we took before his mother left. On the bookshelf where the abstract sculpture used to sit was the photo from his college graduation, me in the stands with a huge, proud smile, him in his cap and gown. He'd kept it in a prominent spot where he'd see it every day. He noticed me looking and said he'd been doing what his therapist suggested, surrounding himself with reminders of what actually mattered. We positioned the bookshelf against his living room wall and stepped back to look at it. Zachary ran his hand along the smooth wood, tested the stability of the shelves, examined the joints I'd cut. He said it was the most beautiful piece of furniture he owned. Then he asked if I'd tell him about my construction career, the real stories he'd never bothered to ask about. He wanted to know about the buildings I'd helped create, the projects I was actually proud of. We got in his car and I directed him around the city, showing him the hospital where he was born, pointing out the wing I'd helped build. We drove past his elementary school where I'd poured the foundation for the new gymnasium, the library downtown where I'd done the concrete work for the addition. the office building where his firm occupied 3 floors, the one I'd mentioned at his Christmas party. He pulled into the parking garage and we sat there looking up at the building. He told me he'd been driving past it regularly since our coffee shop meeting, parking here and thinking about his own arrogance, how he'd dismissed the work that literally held up his career. We walked inside and took the elevator to the lobby. Zachary pointed out the details I'd helped create, the polished concrete floors, the structural columns, the way the building was designed to be both beautiful and functional. He started crying right there in the lobby, not caring who saw. He apologized again, but this time with real understanding of what he'd dismissed and devalued. He said his therapist had him write down everything he'd said to me and about me, then read it back, imagining someone saying those things about him. The exercise destroyed him. He realized he'd spent a year tearing down the man who'd built everything for him, literally and figuratively. I hugged him while he cried, other people walking past us in the lobby, and told him we were going to be okay. The work of rebuilding trust would take time, but we were doing it. Our monthly dinners became twice monthly after that. The conversations got easier and more honest. Zachary told me about insights from therapy, how he was learning to separate his worth from his achievements, how he was working on being less judgmental. I shared my own journey of rebuilding my identity beyond being his father and provider. I talked about discovering woodworking and making friends who valued me for my skills and personality. I told him about Linda and how dating again at 58 was terrifying and wonderful. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. We laughed more. The tension that had filled every interaction for the past year gradually eased. One night after dinner, he said he was grateful I'd set boundaries and refused to enable his behavior. He said if I'd just given him the money and pretended everything was fine, he never would have hit rock bottom and gotten help. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent could do was let their kid face consequences. The following Sunday, Linda and I headed to the brunch place Zachary picked out, one of those trendy spots with exposed brick and plants hanging from the ceiling. He was already there when we arrived, sitting at a corner table and standing up the moment he saw us. I made the introductions and watched him shake Linda's hand with genuine warmth, not the fake politeness I'd worried about. We ordered food, and the conversation started slow, careful, but then Linda mentioned she'd been trying to convince me to join the retirement community's synchronized swimming team. Zachary's eyes lit up, and he asked if I was actually doing water aerobics now. Linda jumped in with this story about how I'd accidentally kicked another swimmer during a routine last week, sending a wave of water across the pool that soaked the instructor. She acted it out with hand gestures, and Zachary laughed so hard he had to put down his coffee. I tried to defend myself, but Linda kept adding details about my terrible form and how I counted beats wrong, and soon all 3 of us were laughing until our sides hurt. The rest of brunch felt easy and natural. Zachary asked Linda about her nursing career and listened to her stories about working in pediatrics for 30 years. She asked him about his job without any awkwardness, and he talked about it without the arrogance that used to fill every word. When we left, Zachary hugged both of us and thanked Linda for taking care of me, which made her beam. 2 days later, I sat in the investment advisor's office reviewing my portfolio from the house sale money. The advisor pulled up charts on his computer screen, showing how my funds had grown over the past few months since I'd hired him. He pointed to the different investments he'd made based on my risk tolerance and retirement timeline. The numbers looked good, steady growth without crazy risks. He told me I'd made smart choices by diversifying and not putting everything in one place. I asked questions about the projections for the next 5 years, and he walked me through different scenarios, explaining things in plain language instead of finance speak. When I left his office, I felt this deep sense of validation. I'd handled my own money without Zachary's help and done it well. The house sale hadn't been wasted or squandered. I'd taken care of my future the same way I'd taken care of everything else in my life, with careful planning and hard work. 3 weeks after that, my phone rang while I was sanding down a jewelry box in the woodworking shop. Zachary's name flashed on the screen, and I stepped outside to take the call. He was talking fast and excited, saying he'd just gotten promoted to managing director at his firm. They'd called him into the partner's office that morning and offered him the position. I congratulated him and asked what the new role meant. He explained the responsibilities and the team he'd be leading, and then he said something that made me stop walking. He told me his therapy sessions and our reconciliation had helped him become a better leader. He'd been working on listening more and being less judgmental, and his bosses noticed the change in how he mentored junior analysts. Not once during the entire call did he mention money or investments or what I should do with my funds. He just wanted to share good news with his dad. The promotion celebration happened at his office the following Friday evening. I put on my good shirt and drove downtown to the building I'd helped construct 30 years ago. The lobby was full of people in business clothes holding wine glasses and talking in clusters. Zachary spotted me right away and brought me over to meet Craig Vaughn, his boss and one of the firm's senior partners. Craig shook my hand with a firm grip and told me Zachary talked about me often and with obvious pride. He said my son had become one of their most valuable team members, not just because of his financial skills, but because of how he developed younger employees. Craig mentioned that Zachary had started a mentorship program focused on work-life balance and family priorities, teaching new analysts that success meant more than just closing deals. I looked at Zachary standing next to me and saw him smiling, not embarrassed or trying to change the subject. He'd actually been telling his colleagues good things about me. My birthday came around in late spring. Zachary picked me up from my apartment and drove us to a restaurant I'd only read about in the newspaper, one of those places with a Michelin star and a 6-month waiting list. The meal was incredible, each course presented like artwork, but the best part came after dessert. Zachary pulled out a wrapped box from under his chair and handed it to me. Inside was a framed photo of the two of us at his high school graduation, him in his cap and gown, and me standing beside him with my arm around his shoulders. Below the photo, he'd added an inscription that read, "Thank you for every sacrifice you made, every game you attended, every lesson you taught me. You gave me everything and I forgot to be grateful. I'm sorry and I love you." I felt tears start running down my face before I could stop them. Zachary reached across the table and squeezed my hand, his own eyes wet. The waiter gave us a minute and I just sat there holding this gift, thinking about how far we'd come from that awful birthday dinner a year ago. Linda and I were having coffee on my apartment balcony a few days later when she brought up the idea of moving in together eventually. Not right away, but maybe in 6 months or a year when we were both ready. She talked about combining our apartments into one of the larger 2-bedroom units the retirement community offered. I listened to her describe how we could set up the space, 1 bedroom for sleeping and 1 for hobbies, her painting supplies and my woodworking plans. The idea felt right and exciting and also a little scary. I realized I was building a whole new life chapter that had nothing to do with being useful or providing for others. This was about choosing to share my life with someone who wanted me around, not because I could give them things, but because she enjoyed my company. We decided to talk to the community manager about options and start planning for a future together. In early June, Jasmine graduated from community college with honors. Roger called to invite me to the ceremony, and I cleared my whole day to be there. The graduation took place in the college's outdoor amphitheater on a sunny Saturday morning. I sat with Roger and his wife in the bleachers, watching hundreds of students in blue caps and gowns file onto the field. When they called Jasmine's name, she walked across the stage to accept her diploma, and I cheered louder than anyone. Later, during the student speeches, Jasmine took the microphone as class representative. She talked about the challenges of working multiple jobs while taking classes, about family members who supported her through late-night study sessions and early morning shifts. Then she specifically mentioned me by name, thanking her uncle for believing in her when she doubted herself. My throat got tight and Roger clapped me on the back, both of us grinning like idiots. After the ceremony, Roger, Jasmine, and I went to lunch at a diner near campus. Jasmine told us about her acceptance to the state university, where she'd be transferring in the fall to finish her bachelor's degree in education. She wanted to be an elementary school teacher. Roger started talking about student loans and payment plans, his face showing the stress of trying to figure out how to afford another 2 years of tuition. I waited until Jasmine excused herself to the bathroom, then told Roger I wanted to help with the university costs. He immediately refused, saying I'd already done enough by naming Jasmine as a beneficiary. I explained that I wanted to invest in someone who valued education and worked hard for it, someone who reminded me why I'd spent 35 years in construction. Roger's eyes got wet, and he nodded slowly. When Jasmine came back to the table, I told her my offer. She stood up from her chair and came around to hug me, so tight I could barely breathe, crying into my shoulder and saying thank you over and over. Zachary called me the next evening and asked if the university tuition offer was true. Roger had mentioned it to another family member who'd told Zachary. I confirmed it and waited for his reaction, unsure if this would trigger old jealousies. Instead, Zachary asked if he could contribute too. He said he wanted to pay forward the opportunities I'd given him, that helping Jasmine felt like the right way to honor what our family should be about. We spent an hour on the phone that night planning out a small scholarship fund together, pooling money to cover not just Jasmine's remaining tuition, but to help future family members who needed education support. Zachary got excited about setting up the fund properly through his firm's charitable foundation, making it official and sustainable. By the time we hung up, we'd created something meaningful together. The woodworking club coordinator approached me after our regular Thursday session to ask if I'd be interested in teaching a beginner's class. Several new members had joined recently and needed someone patient to show them basic techniques. I agreed to try it, and the following week found myself standing in front of 8 people, explaining how to properly measure and cut wood. Teaching came naturally to me. I demonstrated each step slowly, answered questions without making anyone feel stupid, and helped people correct their mistakes without criticism. After the class, 3 different members told me I had a gift for patient instruction. Walking back to my apartment later, I thought about my construction career and all the younger workers I'd mentored over the years. I'd always enjoyed that part of the job, showing someone how to do something right and watching them master it. Maybe this was another way to use skills I'd spent a lifetime developing. Linda's daughter showed up on a Saturday afternoon with her two kids, a boy about 7 and a girl maybe 5. They burst into the community center where Linda and I were playing cards, the kids running straight to their grandmother with that pure energy only young children have. Linda scooped them both up, laughing as they talked over each other about their week at the school. I watched her transform into someone completely different, softer and more playful, making silly faces that had both kids giggling. The boy, Danny, asked if I was the man his grandmother kept talking about, and I said I was. He asked what I did for work, and before I could answer, Linda told him I built the hospital where he was born. His eyes went wide, like I'd suddenly become more interesting. We spent the afternoon showing the kids around the community center, letting them try the woodworking tools under careful watch. Danny wanted to make a toy boat, and I helped him measure and cut the pieces, his small hands gripping the tools with determination. Linda's daughter sat with us, asking questions about my construction career, genuinely interested in the stories I told. Watching Linda with those grandchildren, seeing how natural she was with them, made something shift in my chest. I started thinking about Zachary, about whether he'd ever want kids of his own. The idea of being a grandfather hadn't crossed my mind in years, not since things went bad between us. But seeing Linda light up around Danny and his sister, I realized I wanted that chance. I wanted to teach a grandchild how to use tools, to show them the buildings I'd helped create, to be present in their life the way I'd been present in Zachary's. When Linda's daughter left with the kids, she hugged me and thanked me for being good to her mother. Linda and I sat on the patio after they'd gone, and she asked what I was thinking about. I told her about wanting to be a grandfather someday, if Zachary ever got there. She squeezed my hand and said she thought I'd be wonderful at it. At our next dinner, Zachary brought up children before I could. We were at a different restaurant this time, a quiet Italian place Linda had recommended. He set down his menu and said his therapist had been pushing him to think about his future, not just his career, but his personal life. He admitted he'd been avoiding serious relationships for years, always finding reasons why women weren't right for him. His therapist helped him see he was scared of failing as a parent, scared of abandoning someone the way his mother had abandoned him. The words came out slowly, like he was still working through them himself. I listened without interrupting, letting him get it all out. He said he'd been watching me build this new life with Linda, seeing how I'd found happiness after everything, and it made him realize he wanted that too. He wanted a partner, maybe kids someday, but the fear kept stopping him. I asked him what he thought would happen if he became a father, and he said he was afraid he'd mess it up, that he didn't know how to be a good parent, because he only had one example and he'd spent the last year treating that example like garbage. His voice cracked on that last part. I reached across the table and gripped his shoulder, told him we'd talk about breaking those patterns, about how being a parent wasn't some mystery he couldn't solve. He nodded, his eyes wet, and asked me to tell him what it was really like raising him alone. I started with the hard parts because I wanted him to understand it wasn't perfect. I told him about the nights I'd fall asleep in the chair waiting for him to finish his homework, so tired I could barely see straight. About missing his school events when job sites ran late, feeling like the worst father in the world. About the times I had no idea what I was doing, just making it up as I went and hoping I didn't screw him up too badly. I told him about the loneliness after his mother left, how I'd lie awake wondering if I could really do this alone. But then I told him about the good parts, the parts that made it all worth it. His first soccer goal when he was 6, how he'd run to me on the sidelines instead of his teammates. The science fair in 8th grade where his volcano actually worked and he jumped up and down with excitement. Teaching him to drive in an empty parking lot, both of us laughing when he stalled the car 5 times in a row. Reading him bedtime stories even when he got too old for them because it was our time together. Watching him walk across that graduation stage, knowing I'd kept my promise to give him every opportunity. I explained that parenting wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up every single day, even when you were exhausted or scared or had no clue what to do next. It was about being consistent, being present, being someone your kid could count on no matter what. Zachary listened to every word with this look on his face I hadn't seen in years, like he was really hearing me for the first time. He said he never knew about the hard parts, never realized how much I'd sacrificed. He always thought I made it look easy. I told him that was the point, that's what parents do. They take the hard stuff on themselves so their kids can just be kids. The retirement community announced a family day event in the newsletter, complete with games and a barbecue. I called Zachary and invited him, then checked with Linda about bringing her daughter's family too. The day came warm and sunny, perfect for an outdoor event. Zachary showed up early, helping me set up chairs and tables before anyone else arrived. Linda's daughter came with Danny and his sister, and Roger drove down with Jasmine, who'd taken the day off from one of her jobs. Watching everyone meet and introduce themselves, I felt something settle in my chest that had been restless for months. Zachary crouched down to Danny's level and asked about school, listened to the boys' excited chatter about his teacher and his friends. He helped Danny with the three-legged race, both of them falling over laughing when they couldn't coordinate their steps. Later, I saw him talking with Linda's daughter about teaching, asking genuine questions about her work and her kids. Jasmine showed him pictures of her university acceptance letter, and he congratulated her with real warmth, no hint of the jealousy I'd worried about. Linda stood next to me watching it all, her hand in mine, and said, "This was what family should look like. Not perfect, not fancy, just people who cared about each other spending time together." Zachary caught my eye across the lawn and smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, and I felt hope bloom in my chest. Maybe we really could build something good from the wreckage of what we'd had before. 2 weeks later, Zachary called and asked if we could meet for coffee, said he had something to tell me. We met at the same coffee shop where we'd had our first real conversation after everything fell apart. He looked different, lighter somehow, less tense in his shoulders. He told me he'd been dating someone new, a woman named Emily who taught middle school. They met through a volunteer program his therapist had suggested, reading to kids at an after-school program. He said Emily was different from anyone he'd dated before, more interested in doing good work than making good money. They'd been seeing each other for about a month, taking it slow, actually getting to know each other instead of rushing into anything. He talked about how she challenged him when he got too focused on work, how she made him laugh, how she didn't care about his job title or his apartment or any of the things his previous girlfriends had cared about. I asked what she cared about instead, and he said she wanted to know if he was kind, if he treated people with respect, if he showed up when he said he would. Basic things that actually mattered. He said he was trying to build something real with her, not something impressive, and he wanted me to meet her soon. The pride I felt hearing him talk like that, seeing him focus on the right things for once, made my throat tight. I told him I'd love to meet Emily whenever he was ready. Meeting Emily happened at a casual lunch place she picked, nothing fancy or expensive. She showed up in jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and shook my hand with a firm grip. We sat down and she immediately started asking me questions about construction, said her students were always fascinated by how buildings got made. She wanted to know about the biggest project I'd worked on, the hardest problem I'd solved, what it felt like to see something you built still standing years later. Her interest felt genuine, not polite, and I found myself telling her stories I hadn't thought about in years. She laughed at the right moments, asked smart follow-up questions, and treated my career like it mattered. Zachary watched us talk with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between nervous and hopeful. Emily told me about teaching middle school, about the challenges of reaching kids who didn't think they could learn, about the moments when something clicked and a student's whole face changed. She had the same passion for her work that I'd had for mine, that dedication to doing something meaningful even when it was hard. When she challenged Zachary about something he said, correcting him gently but firmly, I liked her even more. She wasn't going to let him get away with anything, wasn't going to make excuses for him. By the end of lunch, I understood why Zachary was different around her. Emily made him want to be better, not to impress her, but because she expected it. The holidays rolled around faster than I expected, and Linda suggested we combine celebrations with everyone. Her daughter's family, Zachary and Emily, Roger and Jasmine, all together in the community center's party room. I worried it might be too much, too many people who didn't really know each other, but Linda insisted it would be perfect. She was right. The room filled with noise and laughter, kids running around while adults tried to coordinate the meal. Danny showed Jasmine his new toy, and she sat on the floor with him explaining how it worked. Emily helped Linda's daughter set the table while discussing lesson plans and teaching strategies. Roger and I stood at the grill outside, flipping burgers and talking about Jasmine's progress at university. Zachary moved between groups, comfortable and engaged, helping where needed without being asked. This was nothing like the quiet holidays after Zachary's mother left, when it was just the two of us trying to make turkey and watching football in silence. This was loud and chaotic and full of life, exactly what I'd been missing without knowing it. When we finally sat down to eat, the table barely fit everyone, plates and dishes crammed together. Linda proposed a toast to family, both the one you're born into and the one you choose, and everyone raised their glasses. Looking around at all these faces, some familiar and some new, I felt full in a way that had nothing to do with food. Zachary pulled me aside during dessert, asked if we could talk privately for a minute. We stepped out onto the patio where it was quieter, the noise from inside muffled by the closed door. He looked nervous, his hands in his pockets, and I waited for him to find his words. He said he was planning to propose to Emily in the spring, wanted to do it right, wanted to build a real life with her. Then he asked if I'd help him pick out a ring, said he valued my judgment and wanted my input on something this important. The request caught me off guard, not because it was strange, but because it meant he trusted me again with the big decisions. I told him I'd be honored to help, and he smiled with relief. He talked about his plans, how he wanted to propose somewhere meaningful, somewhere that represented their future together, rather than trying to impress her. He said Emily had been asking about having kids someday, and the conversation didn't scare him the way it used to. He felt ready, or at least ready to try, because he had good examples now of what family should look like. He meant me, meant what he'd seen at Family Day and this holiday celebration. I gripped his shoulder and told him he was going to be fine, better than fine, because he was thinking about the right things and learning from his mistakes. We stood there in the cold for a few more minutes, just being together, before heading back inside to rejoin everyone. Ring shopping turned out to be more complicated than I expected, but Zachary took it seriously, examining each option carefully. We went to 3 different jewelers before he found something that felt right, a simple band with a single stone, elegant without being flashy. While the jeweler sized it and prepared the paperwork, Zachary talked about his future with Emily. He said they'd discussed having kids, maybe 2 or 3, and Emily wanted to wait a couple years, but they both knew it was part of their plan. He promised his children would know their grandfather, would hear stories about what I'd done for him, would understand that hard work in any form deserved respect. He said he'd make sure they knew I built hospitals and schools, that I worked 12-hour shifts to give him opportunities, that I showed up every single day even when it was hard. His voice got thick with emotion, and I had to look away for a second. He said he wanted his kids to respect all kinds of work, to understand that a person's worth wasn't measured by their job title or their salary. They'd learn that from him, and they'd learn it from knowing me. The jeweler came back with the ring in a small box, and Zachary held it carefully, like he was holding his whole future. We walked out of the store together, and he thanked me for coming, for helping him, for giving him another chance to get this right. I called my lawyer the next week and said I needed to update my will again. She sounded surprised since we'd just made changes, but I explained that circumstances had shifted. When I arrived at her office, I told her I wanted to split everything 3 ways now, between Zachary, Jasmine, and any future grandchildren. She typed notes while I explained the whole story, how Zachary and I had found our way back to each other, how he was building a good life with someone who valued the right things. She stopped typing and looked at me with this smile, said this was the happiest will revision meeting she'd ever had. Usually people came in angry or sad, fighting over money or cutting people out. But here I was, putting someone back in, expanding my family instead of shrinking it. I told her about Zachary's plans to propose, about his promises that his children would know their grandfather, about the scholarship fund we'd set up for Jasmine and future family members who needed education support. The lawyer said it sounded like I'd built something more valuable than any house or retirement account, that I'd built real relationships based on respect and love. She finished the paperwork and I signed everything, feeling lighter with each signature. This will wasn't about punishment or protection anymore. It was about hope and family and second chances. When I left her office, I called Zachary and told him what I'd done. He got quiet for a long moment, then said thank you in a voice that told me he understood what it meant, that I believed in him again, that I trusted him with not just money, but with carrying on what mattered. 2 weeks after our conversation about the proposal, Zachary called me on a Tuesday evening with nervous energy in his voice. He'd made a reservation at the steakhouse for Friday night, the same one where everything had fallen apart between us during his birthday dinner. He wanted to propose there, turning that painful memory into something beautiful. I asked if he was sure about the location, and he said that's exactly why it mattered. He wanted Emily to say yes in the place where he'd hit rock bottom, where he'd called me worthless and talked about my house like it was just money sitting there. The symbolism meant something to him, reclaiming that space with love instead of leaving it tainted. Friday came and I waited by my phone, checking it every few minutes even though I knew dinner reservations were for 7. Linda noticed my distraction during our evening walk and squeezed my hand, reminding me that Zachary had grown into someone who understood what mattered. At 8:30, my phone rang and Zachary's voice came through shaking with happiness. She'd said yes. Emily had cried and said yes, and the whole restaurant had applauded when he got down on one knee. He thanked me for helping him pick the ring, for believing he could be better, for not giving up on him when he'd given me every reason to. I heard Emily laughing in the background, asking to talk to me, and her voice was warm and genuine as she thanked me for raising such a good man, even when he'd forgotten it for a while. Linda and I had been talking about combining our apartments for a few weeks, both of us ready to make things official, but neither wanting to rush. The retirement community offered a larger 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor, with better views and more space for both our things. We signed the paperwork on a Monday and scheduled the move for the following weekend. When I mentioned it to Zachary, he immediately offered to help, saying he owed me about 1,000 favors, and moving furniture was the least he could do. Saturday morning, he showed up in old jeans and a t-shirt, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. We loaded boxes and furniture while Emily and Linda organized things in the new place, and at one point Zachary joked that he was finally useful for something besides his investment advice. Linda heard him and laughed, and I joined in, and suddenly we were all laughing at the callback to those awful months when he'd measured his worth in dollars. The move took most of the day, but felt easy with everyone working together, and by evening we were sitting in the new living room eating pizza and talking about wedding plans. Emily pulled me aside 2 weeks later while we were all having dinner at their apartment. She asked if we could talk privately, and my stomach dropped for a second before I saw her nervous smile. We stepped out onto their balcony, and she told me her father had passed away from cancer when she was 19, that she'd always imagined him walking her down the aisle someday. She asked if I would do it instead, if I would give her away at the wedding. My throat got tight, and I had to look away for a moment before I could answer. I told her I'd be honored, that I felt like I was gaining a daughter instead of losing a son. She hugged me and started crying a little, saying Zachary had told her everything about our rough patch and how we'd found our way back to each other. She said she saw how much I loved my son, and that's the kind of father-in-law she wanted in her life. The wedding happened on a Saturday in early June at a small venue with gardens and string lights. About 60 people came, mostly Emily's teaching colleagues and friends, some of Zachary's co-workers and our little chosen family. I walked Emily down an aisle lined with white chairs, her hand tucked into my arm, and handed her over to my son, who looked at her like she was his whole world. The ceremony was simple and beautiful, and when Zachary said his vows, he turned to look at me for a moment. He thanked me publicly for teaching him what real love and commitment looked like through actions, not words. He said he'd spent too long measuring success by the wrong things, but his father had shown him through 35 years of construction work and single parenting what it meant to build something that mattered. His voice cracked and Emily squeezed his hands, and I saw people in the audience wiping their eyes. I had to blink hard to keep my own tears back. The reception moved to a covered patio area where tables were set up with flowers and candles. After dinner, Zachary stood up to give a speech, and the room went quiet. He talked about how he'd almost lost the most important relationship in his life because he measured worth in dollars instead of character. He told everyone about calling me worthless, about dismissing my construction career as basic labor, about assuming the house I'd paid off was just his inheritance waiting to happen. His voice stayed steady, even though I could see the emotion in his face. Then he looked right at me and said I was his hero, that I'd built hospitals and schools and a good man, and this time he meant it from his heart. The room erupted in applause, and I had to stand up and hug him while people cheered. 6 months after the wedding, Zachary and Emily invited Linda and me over for Sunday brunch. We'd been doing this regularly, trading off who hosted, building the kind of family routine I'd always wanted. Emily made French toast and bacon, while Zachary poured coffee, and halfway through the meal they both got this look on their faces. Emily reached over and took Zachary's hand, and he grinned like he couldn't hold it in anymore. They were expecting a baby, due in July. I was going to be a grandfather. The joy hit me so hard I couldn't speak for a moment, just sat there feeling this pure happiness spread through my chest. Linda jumped up and hugged Emily while I grabbed Zachary and held him tight, both of us laughing. He said he hoped he could be half the father I'd been to him, and I told him he'd already learned the most important lesson, which was showing up and being present. I started building a crib the next week in my woodworking shop at the retirement community. It became the most careful and loving project I'd ever completed. Each piece measured 3 times, each joint fitted perfectly, every surface sanded smooth. I chose a light oak that would match any nursery colors, and I carved small details into the headboard showing construction tools and a book. It took me 2 months working a few hours every day, and when I finally finished, I called Zachary to come see it. He walked into the workshop and stopped when he saw the crib sitting there in the afternoon light. He ran his hand over the wood and read the small inscription I'd carved along the bottom rail. Then he started crying, really crying, and told me his child would sleep in something made by hands that built hospitals and schools, and a good man. We stood there together in my workshop while he cried, and I held my son, both of us thinking about the future. Emily went into labor on a hot July afternoon, and Zachary called me from the hospital, his voice high with excitement and nerves. Linda and I drove over and waited in the family room while hours passed. Finally, a nurse came out and told us we could come meet the baby. I walked into that hospital room and saw my son holding this tiny bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. Zachary looked up at me with tears running down his face and said they'd named him Jack Campbell Jr. I held my grandson for the first time in the same hospital I'd helped build 30 years ago when I was a young construction worker with a wife and a baby boy of my own. Everything had come full circle in the best possible way, and I thought about all the years of laying concrete and pouring foundations, all the buildings I'd helped create, and how they'd led to this moment. Zachary brought little Jack to visit every week, sometimes twice a week, always calling first to make sure we were home. I watched my son be the father I'd taught him to be, patient and present and proud. He'd cut back his overtime hours to be home for dinner with Emily and the baby, having learned what really mattered. He'd rock Jack in the chair I'd built, singing the same songs I used to sing to him, and I'd see him look up at me sometimes with this expression of understanding. He got it now, what I'd sacrificed and why, what it meant to put your child first, even when it was hard. Little Jack would grab my finger with his tiny hand, and I'd think about how this was what I'd worked for all those years, not the money or the house or anything material, but this connection across generations. Sunday dinner became our tradition with my whole chosen family around the table in our apartment. Linda set out plates while I carved the roast, and Zachary held Jack on his lap, helping Emily serve vegetables. Roger and Jasmine came with updates about her university classes, and Linda's daughter brought her kids who played with Jack's toys on the floor. We squeezed around the table that barely fit everyone, passing dishes and talking over each other, and I looked around at all these faces. Linda squeezed my hand under the table and smiled at me. I wasn't worthless or just useful for my money. I was surrounded by people who loved me for exactly who I was, a retired construction worker who'd built a good life with his hands and his heart. My life was richer than I ever imagined possible, not because of what I owned, but because of who I had around me, and I finally understood that this was what wealth really meant.